Somewhere out there, you might imagine one single ancient human, on one single night, rubbing two sticks together for the first time, watching a spark catch, and suddenly changing the entire future of our species. It's a great image, it's dramatic, it's satisfying, and it's almost certainly not what actually happened. Here's the strange part. After more than a century of digging, testing, and arguing about it, scientists still can't tell you exactly who discovered fire, exactly when it happened, or even exactly what discovering fire really means. That might sound like a letdown, but stick with this one, because the real answer is honestly weirder, messier, and more interesting than a single dramatic moment around one campfire. So let's actually dig into it. Who discovered fire first? And why is that question so much harder to answer than it sounds? Let's start with something most people never think about. Discovering fire isn't really one event. It's at least three separate, very different achievements. And they likely happened at wildly different points in time, maybe hundreds of thousands of years apart from each other. The first stage is simply using fire that already exists, not making it, just using it when it happens to be there. Wildfires are a completely natural part of many ecosystems, especially in Africa, where lightning strikes dry grasslands regularly and sets off blazes that burn for hours or days. Early hominins living in these landscapes would have encountered burned ground constantly, probably from the very beginning of their existence. And here's where things get interesting. A burned landscape isn't just ash and destruction. It's also, weirdly, an opportunity. Animals caught in wildfires sometimes end up accidentally roasted. Burned ground is easier to walk across and see predators on. And a smoldering log or ember, if you're brave enough or curious enough to approach it, gives off warmth on a cold night. So the very first stage of discovering fire probably wasn't a discovery at all, in the way we usually think about it. It was almost certainly an accident, repeated over and over again, across countless generations, in countless different places, by multiple different early hominin populations who never met each other and never communicated the idea to one another. There wasn't one light bulb moment. There were probably thousands of small, disconnected, accidental ones. Now here's where the actual scientific mystery begins, because using fire opportunistically is very different from the second stage, controlling it. Controlling fire means something specific. It means keeping an existing flame alive on purpose, feeding it fuel, protecting it from wind and rain, and relying on it regularly, rather than just stumbling across a lucky ember once in a while. This is where the archaeological evidence gets genuinely fascinating, and also genuinely contested. One of the strongest and oldest pieces of evidence for controlled fire use comes from a site called Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. Researchers examining sediment layers deep inside the cave found burned bone fragments and plant ash, dated to roughly 1 million years ago. Crucially, this evidence was found deep inside the cave, far from the entrance, in a spot where a natural wildfire almost certainly couldn't have reached on its own. That detail matters enormously. Fire deep inside a cave, far from any lightning strike or grass fire, strongly suggests that someone carried it in, deliberately, and kept it burning there. Researchers studying the Wonderwerk Cave sediment used some genuinely clever techniques to reach that conclusion, including analyzing the microscopic structure of the burned plant ash and bone fragments under specialized equipment. Natural wildfire ash tends to look and behave differently at a microscopic level compared to ash from a controlled, sustained fire kept in one specific spot over time. The patterns found deep in the cave were far more consistent with a fire that had been maintained carefully in a fixed location, rather than the chaotic, widespread residue you'd expect from a wildfire sweeping through. Around the same general era, though at a different location, evidence at a site in Israel called Gesher Benot Ya'aqov, dated to roughly 790,000 years ago, shows repeated small clusters of burned material concentrated in specific spots, which many researchers interpret as early hearths, used again and again over time, rather than one-off accidents. So somewhere in this vast stretch of time, probably somewhere between about 1 million and 700,000 years ago, some populations of early humans, likely Homo erectus or closely related species, crossed the line from occasionally near fire to living with fire on purpose. But here's the twist that tends to genuinely surprise people. This wasn't a clean, single, universal turning point. Evidence of regular, unmistakable, widespread fire use doesn't become common and consistent across many different sites until much later, roughly around 400,000 years ago, when hearths start showing up clearly and repeatedly at multiple locations across Europe and the Middle East. That's an enormous gap. Hundreds of thousands of years separate the earliest possible hints of controlled fire from the point where it seems to have become a normal, dependable part of daily human life almost everywhere. Why the gap? Nobody knows for certain. It's possible that fire use started in a few isolated groups and spread slowly. It's possible different populations kept losing the habit and had to rediscover it independently. If a group's fire went out and nobody in that group knew how to start a new one from scratch. It's possible the evidence from the earlier period is simply harder to find and preserve, and future discoveries could push the timeline back even further. This uncertainty is honestly part of what makes the question, who discovered fire first, so hard to answer cleanly. There likely wasn't one single first. There were probably many separate, scattered beginnings, some of which worked, and some of which may have quietly failed and had to start over. Now, let's talk about the third stage, because this is where the story gets genuinely surprising, and it connects directly to the title of this video. Using fire is one thing. Keeping fire alive once you have it is another. But actually creating fire from nothing, on demand, whenever you need it, is a completely different skill. Think about it this way. A group that found a burning branch after a wildfire could carry it, protect it, and feed it fuel for a long time. Some human groups throughout history have been documented carrying embers over long distances, specifically to avoid the problem of having to start a brand new fire. But if that fire ever went out completely, through bad weather, an accident, or simple bad luck, and nobody in the group actually knew how to create fire from scratch, they were right back to depending on luck again, waiting for the next wildfire or lightning strike. So here's the surprising part. The ability to reliably create fire on demand, using techniques like friction, rubbing certain types of wood together in specific ways, or percussion, striking certain minerals like pyrite against flint to throw sparks, appears to be a much later development than simply using and maintaining fire. Some of the clearest archaeological evidence for deliberate fire-starting tools, things like pieces of flint and pyrite showing wear patterns consistent with repeated striking, dates to tens of thousands of years ago, dramatically more recent than that first million-year-old evidence from Wonderwerk Cave. In other words, for an almost unimaginably long stretch of time, possibly hundreds of thousands of years, humans and their close relatives may have been fire keepers long before they were fire makers. They could use it. They could maintain it. They could pass it carefully from camp to camp, from generation to generation, treating an existing flame almost like a living thing that needed constant care. But actually being able to summon fire out of nothing, whenever it was needed, that may have come dramatically later. Let's pause here for a fun fact, because this idea, carrying fire rather than making it, actually shows up across a surprising number of human cultures throughout history. In various traditional societies documented by anthropologists, carrying a smoldering ember or slow-burning material during travel was a common, practical solution, precisely because starting a fresh fire from scratch could be difficult, time-consuming, or occasionally impossible, depending on available materials and weather conditions. Some communities developed specific slow-burning materials, things like certain dried fungi or tightly wrapped bundles of particular plant fibers, chosen specifically because they could hold a glowing ember for hours without fully burning out, making them ideal for transporting fire safely over long distances, sometimes across entire journeys lasting days. This wasn't guesswork. It reflects generations of accumulated, carefully tested knowledge about exactly which materials worked best for the job. Firekeeping, in other words, wasn't some primitive stopgap measure. In many contexts, it was simply the smarter, more reliable strategy. Now here's another twist worth knowing, because not every claimed piece of early fire evidence has held up well under closer scientific scrutiny. For decades, a site called Zhoukoudian in China, associated with a population of Homo erectus often nicknamed Peking Man, was cited as strong evidence of controlled fire use, dating back several 100,000 years. Layers of what looked like ash and burned material were found alongside animal bones and stone tools. But here's the strange part. More recent detailed re-examinations of that site have raised serious questions. Some researchers now argue that at least some of the material originally identified as ash may actually be naturally decomposed sediment or organic matter, not the remains of deliberately controlled fires at all. This doesn't mean the site is definitely wrong. Scientists are still debating it, but it's a genuinely important reminder that figuring out the true history of fire isn't just about finding old ash. It's about carefully proving that ash came from a fire that was deliberately built, maintained, and used by humans, rather than a wildfire that happened to pass through, or even something that isn't burned material at all. This might sound like a small technical distinction, but it genuinely matters for a much bigger reason. The timeline for when humans mastered fire is tightly connected to other major questions in human evolution, including when cooked food became a regular part of the human diet, when humans could safely occupy colder climates, and when larger, more complex social groups became possible around a shared hearth. Push the fire timeline earlier or later, even by a few 100,000 years, and it can reshape entire theories about how and why the human brain, body, and social structures evolved the way they did. That's exactly why researchers argue so carefully over ash samples that, to most of us, would just look like dirt. This is exactly why the question in this video's title is so tricky to answer with total confidence. Every time researchers think they've nailed down a clear, first, new analysis, new technology, or new discoveries can shift the picture again. So if you're looking for a single named person, a single tribe, or even a single clearly defined moment in time that represents the discovery of fire, the honest scientific answer is that it probably doesn't exist, and it may never be fully identified, because it likely wasn't one event at all. Instead, picture something more like this: scattered groups of early hominins, across enormous stretches of time and across different continents, independently stumbling onto burned landscapes again and again. Some of them cautiously approaching the warmth. Some of them, eventually, learning to keep a flame going instead of letting it die out. Some of them, much later, finally figuring out how to summon a brand new flame entirely from scratch, using nothing but friction, sparks, and patience. Layer upon layer, across staggering amounts of time, slowly building towards something we now take completely for granted every time we casually flick a lighter. Here's one more fact worth sitting with before we wrap up. Because fire leaves behind physical evidence, ash, charred bone, heat-cracked stone, this is actually one of the more well-documented technological transitions in all of early human history, even with all the remaining uncertainty and scientific debate. Compare that to something like the origins of human language, which left behind essentially no direct physical evidence at all, and you start to appreciate just how valuable and how rare this kind of archaeological trail really is. So here's where all of this leaves us. There was no single ancient genius striking the first spark on a quiet night, changing the world in one dramatic instant. There was something slower, messier, and honestly, a lot more human than that. Countless separate encounters with an unpredictable force of nature. Countless small moments of curiosity, caution, and trial and error, spread across different populations, different continents, and staggering lengths of time, most of which left no trace at all, and will likely never be known. The version of fire's discovery that actually survives in the physical evidence isn't one hero moment. It's a very long, very patient relationship, built slowly between an unpredictable, dangerous, and incredibly useful natural force, and a species that simply refused to stop paying attention to it. So here's something worth thinking about. If one of the most important turning points in human history wasn't a single dramatic discovery, but thousands of small, scattered, accidental ones stretched across hundreds of thousands of years, how many other things we now think of as single brilliant discoveries might actually be the exact same kind of long, quiet, collective story?